All right, so the event has been recorded as we speak. All right. Well, the session for today is dedicated on formulating research questions, and it's inevitable when we talk about research questions to talk about concepts and variables. So those will be the three issues that I would like to cover. But before I move into really practicalities in how to formulate research questions, looking at verbs which are related to specific goals of your project, we need to look at that. We need to look at how did you start it and what does it mean for the formulation of the research questions. So how are the questions that you pose in your study related to what you want to study, so the study concepts? What are actually concepts, constructs, and variables? And how are these usually used in a study? And as I mentioned before, I hit the button to record. I have 3 examples at the end. So 2 which are actually related to projects to graduates, and 1 related to a study that I'm conducting myself, which very well illustrates the use of concepts and how they are translated into, in this case, questionnaires, so into variables. So before we zoom into the wording of the research questions, we do need to realize that the way we formulate the question is very much related to what we want to achieve with our study. So we need to think of how we started the study. We need to think from the very first ideas in our introduction until the moment that we formulated the objectives of the study, and after the objectives, the questions. So you asked yourself already, what is the problem that I'm facing? What is the problem that the company you work for is facing, or the question not yet answered within that company, or the opportunity not yet seized by the industry or part of the industry? So what was your starting point? Then you had to think of, why is this a problem? Why does this question occur? What is the opportunity? And for whom is it? And when you talk about for whom is this problem, you can think of the 3 perspectives, the micro, meso, and macro. Is your problem related to individuals? Is your problems related to departments, or the functioning of departments, organizations, or maybe wider the industry itself? Who exactly is involved in the context of your study? So those were the initial questions that you already asked yourself when you were describing the introduction of your thesis, or when you're thinking of how to describe the context of your thesis. And the answers to these questions are very relevant for the type of objectives that you're going to formulate for yourself, and as a consequence as well, the way you will formulate the questions, let alone the variables, but that will come in a minute. You already also asked yourself what is already known about this problem, or about this question, or about this opportunity. You probably already started reading in papers. You looked at company results or industry statistics. And by reading papers, I mean you looked at earlier research in order to get the feeling of how do people study the concept that I'm interested in. So how do people study the needs and wants of clients or guests? How do people study level of knowledge of, how do people study service experience? How is service quality, for instance, measured? Just a couple of examples that I know of your project. And you have to think of what will be my contribution, right? So what is that I would like to achieve with my project? And what is the type of intervention that I'm proposing related to the problem that I identified? And when I say problem, then I also mean the questions that are at play, or the opportunities not seized. So in this case, we talk about a type of intervention. And by that, I mean, is it an advisory report that you're going to write? So is it an advice that you're going to give? Is it a business plan you're going to write? So a business model that you need to develop? Or is it going to be a design report that you're going to write? So that is meant by your contribution. And based on defining which path you are taking and how is that related to the specific context you described above, you will be able to formulate your research objectives. Meaning, what do you intend to achieve with your project? I would like to make a very short intermezzo on the definition of a problem, or the perspective on a problem. As when we talk about problems in bachelor theses or in scientific research in general, we need to remind ourselves that we do not talk about problems which need immediate solution as such. Even though sometimes the starting point of a project might be an operational or strategic problem as experienced by the people involved, like for instance, high turnover, low level of satisfaction of internal clients, or low level of satisfaction of guests, just three very simple examples. But when we set up our studies, we don't talk about such kind of problems, but we consider research problems as being something else. So the scientific definition of wording of a problem means something else. It can mean a societal or human-centered problem, for instance, back injuries of cleaners, high turnover for that problem, or it can also mean the so-called cognitive problem. We lack knowledge on reasons why people behave the way they do. Sorry. We lack knowledge of why a certain age group chooses for specific restaurant concepts. We lack knowledge on the consequences of specific choices that internal clients make or buyers make. We lack knowledge in all possible solutions and their effects, and so on and so on. So, in fact, problems in your project refer to what I like to call them knowledge problems, those cognitive problems that you are facing. So problems mean, in our context, what is it we do not know yet? And that's where, instead of talking of a research question, maybe we can think of, what is the knowledge problem that we face? What is that piece of knowledge that we miss, which it will enable us to achieve the aim that we have set with our problem, with our thesis? What is that I need to know first in order to be able to come up with prototypes, which will be possibly the answer for the new lobby design that the hospital is facing. So this is the perspective on problems that I would like you to adopt when you think of how do you formulate the research questions. So I'm sorry, let me go back one slide. With the research objectives indeed equal knowledge problems. What is that we do not know yet? And that will help us to formulate those questions. And actually the objectives and the questions in wording even are very, very closely related. When you think of your objectives, you can, for instance, also think of what are you going to study exactly? Who are you going to study? What is the key concept in your study? Like, for instance, is it the needs and the wants of a specific generation? Is it the factors influencing decision-making process? Is it efficiency of meetings? There's a diversity in concepts that you are dealing with, and maybe at this stage you already have a model or a theoretical framework which help you to view that problem, which help you to create a lens and think of your of the concepts you're interested in from that theoretical perspective. One of you, for instance, already spotted a theory which is called menu psychology, which not a robust theory, but a theoretical framework which helps the graduate to find this lens and use this lens when answering the research questions that she has formulated. So the objectives and the questions are very much related. What do I mean with an example? Let me just change a bit my let me just change the video on my screen, because otherwise I cannot see what happened on the slides. So imagine that you are interested in how effective are internet and internet channel as a means to communicate with NHTV students. I think this is a very legitimate question, which can be a research question. that our marketing department here at NHTD asks. So how effective are the channels that we use when we communicate with the students, and maybe even is there a difference between internet and intranet channels that we use? So asking a question like that, the department actually has set a couple of objectives, and those can be to identify each internet and internet channel students use, to describe the company objectives for each channel, to explore and describe specific examples of how each channel has been beneficial or influential and which one were not influential or beneficial. An objective can be related to this question is to determine a measure of effectiveness for each channel. When do we know? It's already hidden in the main question. When do we know if a communication channel is effective? So how do we measure that? A next step might be, or objective might be, to compare those measures of effectiveness across the channel. And when we compare at the end effectiveness of channels, we will be able, so the answers of questions we can formulate will enable us to make recommendations to the marketing department and say which channel can be used in the future and how fit is it for the purpose to communicate with the NHTV students. So very often we have our research objectives already formulated in a way like this. There's very clearly defined what we want to achieve with our project, and I can actually very simply modify those objectives and make research questions out of them, make sub-research questions if you wish out of them. I'm going to exit now this just for the sake of the example. See if I can make it a little bit bigger for you. So if a aim or research objectives that I have formulated my study is to identify each internet and internet channel of student communication used, what I simply can do now is to ask what are the internet and internet channel used for student communication. This is a very descriptive question because it actually helps me to find out what is used currently. And the next one I can reformulate in a similar vein. What are the company objectives for each channel? And what I'm trying to say with this actually is that what you intend to achieve on such a detailed level can be very helpful when you think of questions, knowledge questions that you're going to formulate for your project. And another important element in here that I would like to add is that we actually ask you to go beyond a simple description. You also see it on this list. Let me make it now already bigger again. So if you look at all those possible objectives, which I can reformulate into questions, is that the first one are very descriptive, but one of the last ones, like the comparison of measures, for instance, goes beyond description. It asks to judge on the effectiveness between different channels, and we expect you with the bachelor thesis to do exactly that. So there where possible to go beyond that description, which will enable you to make recommendations specific to the context of your study. And another item which I have here on the slide is the idea that very often our questions have also the so-called theoretical or empirical component. And what do I mean by this? I found the distinction between theoretical and empirical questions very useful myself when I was studying for my master's, especially if you have lots of sub-questions that you have formulated already for yourself. Some of you don't have so many sub-questions, but in case you do have a lot of sub-questions, then I think a very handy way to, in a way, structure your work and how you give answers to those questions is to define them in what I call theoretical questions and empirical questions, meaning which questions I can ask theoretically, I can answer theoretically, I can answer by referring to existing knowledge, and for which sub-questions I need to gather data myself. if we have a look, for instance, at the list I have in here, if I have to determine the measures of effectiveness of each channel, I can approach and formulate a question out of this objective. I can ask what measures are there to measure effectiveness of communication channel, and I can basically review articles who have reported on measuring effectiveness of communication channels. So I don't necessarily have to test that myself by gathering data, but I can learn from others who already have asked that question and who already have conducted studies and who will be able to tell me, well, if you really want to compare effectiveness across channels, these are the measures that you can use in order to identify if indeed a channel is effective and how effective it is. But for instance, if I'm going to answer the question, what are the internet and intranet channels used for student communication? Well, I cannot possibly answer this question simply by reading papers, so I will have to collect data myself. Same goes for what are company objectives for each channel, so I'll most probably have to refer to policy documents, maybe talk to people as well working at the marketing department. So those will be the so-called empirical sub-questions. I don't have a source necessarily which I use today, which defines the theoretical and empirical component in questions, but I've learned this in the past, and I think for some of you it might be a handy way to think of your sub-questions and also thinking in where are you going to place the answers to those questions in your thesis. Let me see. Another way to look mainly at your main research questions is to take the distinction as Gray identifies it, and by Gray I mean the investigative abilities book that you have at your disposal, doing research in the real world. And if you are not using Gray, maybe using Bryman and Bell. Bryman and Bell offers a very, very similar distinction between types of questions. We can view main research questions as being descriptive, or as being explanatory questions, or as being interpretive and exploratory questions. Well, when we ask descriptive questions, the title says it all. We're actually describing the concept of the phenomenon of interest. For instance, how much of Y exists? Why did X develop? How does X work? Imagine that you'll be interested in resistance to change. You can ask such a descriptive question by simply asking what is the level of resistance to change, for instance. So that's a descriptive approach. The explanatory puzzle, so the explanatory type of main research questions look at relationships. They're interested in finding how concepts are related, or how concepts are associated with each other. So what, if any, relationship is there between X and Y? Why does X influence Y is inherent also into quantitative type of analysis. For instance, what do customers think of a new product and why they like or dislike it is an example of a question like this. The interpretative and exploratory type of questions, Gray defines them as questions which actually seek to uncover people's views, perception, the deeper meaning of their attitudes, of their behavior. And he gives an example of what is the impact of X on Y. And actually he calls, or he defines those types of questions as questions who demand qualitative type of approach. So talking to people, observing, using focus groups as method to collect your data, and so on. So that's another way to define also the main research question. And I'm using this distinction of Gray because it's a very valuable one later on when you think of what is then I'm going to measure, when you think of the type of analysis that you need as well in order to be able to answer those questions. Another way, which is probably known to the students who follow the BT course, as I extensively explained that one in one of the first clips related to the bachelor thesis process, is the research cube as defined by a Dutch educational specialist. Actually, he's writing a lot of books related to methodologies, research methodology for students, Bokken van der Zee. He has developed this research cube where he classifies research in multiple ways by actually using the type of question as a classification, the place of gathering data, and the number of respondents. But why I'm sharing this, because the type of question that is used as a main research question from this perspective also actually tells something about the aim of the project. So the aim of the project is translated into the way that you formulate the question. So even without literally writing out what's the aim of your question, if one only looks at what's the aim of your study, if one only looks at how you have formulated the research question, we'll be able to understand what you intend to achieve with it. Do you intend to describe a concept? Do you intend to find out if there's a relationship between a concept? Do you intend to explore a concept and find out the underlying meaning behind it? And he offers this research cube. Now, I only would like to ask you now to look at the left side, where based on the aim of the study and the way that the research question is formulated, for instance, you can talk about also evaluation research, where intervention has been evaluated. Imagine that you already worked for a company for 6 months and you have introduced a type of training aiming at using that training for staff to influence their motivation, or using that training for staff to influence the level of guest satisfaction. You can decide currently to conduct evaluation research in which you're going to evaluate the effect of that training, and in this example, it will be the effect on motivation of staff or the effect on the level of guest satisfaction. Same goes for descriptive research. Will be very much related to descriptive type of research questions, the exploratory research to exploratory type of research questions. So I'm sharing this because, again, this gives you a very, very clear idea, I think, in how the aim and the way you formulate a question are tightly related. So what I would like to do now is zoom into qualitative and quantitative studies. By that, I ignore mixed designs again. I'm not going to talk specifically about that. And in a way, I'm also not really spending a lot of time on questions related to design reports and design thinking. From what I know, I'm not an expert in design thinking, but what I know so far in design thinking is that if you adopt that perspective, actually you don't necessarily think in research questions, or you don't necessarily use research questions, but you think more in aims. However, I think that this is very valuable also for students who will follow that design thinking approach, because as I said at the beginning, if you consider what you want to know as a knowledge question, so asking yourself, what is the piece of information that I need to gather first before I can come up with prototypes and before I know how to test those prototypes and so on and so forth, well, it is still valuable to listen now to this very practical and hands-on information on how do we formulate then those types of knowledge questions, even though I'm talking only about qualitative or quantitative studies. So let's zoom into the qualitative studies first. Quick reminder, qualitative studies focus on exploring or understanding one single phenomenon, so the deeper meaning of behavioral attitudes. Qualitative studies is not about association or relation between variables, and it's not about comparing groups. It can evolve into exploration of possible relationships, but that is not initially the goal of a qualitative study. So when we look into how qualitative research questions can be formulated, We see that qualitative researchers actually, some of the authors that I refer to say, they don't also use lots of objectives. Hypotheses are not formulated, and you are able to find out two types of qualitative research questions. A central research question, which is formulated usually in a very, very broad way, and a couple of sub-questions which help you to narrow down and focus your study. In terms of numbers, that's also very often asked. Qualitative type of studies might have one, even two central questions, and might have 5 to 7 sub-questions. I would like to point out, though, that those sub-questions are not there is no such thing as that you have to have sub-questions. My experience with my master thesis, writing my master thesis, which was a qualitative type of study, is that I was able, after conducting my literature review, so after reading on the topic of organizational learning in my case, I was able to formulate a couple of sub-questions. And actually those sub-questions were very helpful because they gave me enough and they gave me specific inputs in knowing what I'm going to ask during the interviews that I chose as data collection instrument. So I think for many of you that is using sub-questions is instrumental, meaning it gives you structure into knowing what specifically that you would like to know and would like to focus on within the qualitative study that you're conducting. And on the long run, it can help to define also the topics and opening questions in an interview or in a focus group interview if that's the data collection instrument that you're choosing. So in terms of verbs, qualitative research questions, we usually start with what or how, not with why or how much, because these actually imply relationships. And you constantly have to ask yourself, what is that one thing that I would like to understand? What is that one phenomenon or that one concept, as I'm going to call it from now on, that I would like to explore? Is it type of behavior? Is it level of? Is it the type of attitude? And when we have such kind of research questions, the action verbs and phrases used are understand, explore, discover, examine the meaning of. What is also important in qualitative type of questions is that you follow the law of no direction. Meaning, if you're interested in experiences, then you will have to force yourself to think in experiences and not, for instance, in successful experiences. Because if already in your questions you will have the word successful experiences, that will limit you from finding out what possibly not that successful experiences. So qualitative researchers are supposed to follow this idea of no direction, so the law of no direction. And once you start using adjectives, you actually start implying and assuming directions. And in this line of thinking, that's actually not done. So also no words as affect, relate, impact, influence, determine, cause. So those will be, yeah, well, you should not use them. Use open-ended questions. That's also very important when you formulate, well, actually for quantitative questions that goes as well. Very often we tend to formulate our research questions as closed questions, but if you think of the what and the how, and force yourself to start your question like that, then you can easily transform them. For instance, is there a difference in information literacy between age categories? Easily can be transformed into saying, what is the difference in information literacy between age categories? What is also quite commonly done, even in research questions already, is that you're going to specify the participants or the research site, meaning the type of department that you're interested in. For instance, you can say, what is the level of resistance at the front office in Hotel X? Or the level of resistance, and I mean resistance to change in this example. And if you cannot, when you formulate research questions, incorporate also the participants or the research sites, then at least explain it shortly after the research questions by saying, who are you going to investigate and who is part of your investigation? And by doing that, you are in fact already thinking of the scope of your study. By literally identifying who is part of it, you're also saying who is not part of it. And well, that's very useful when you think of the scope and limitations of your project. More examples related to qualitative questions, this time from Gray. I find actually this distinction also very helpful. So besides the verbs that you can or cannot use and the way you can start formulating your questions, he also says that in qualitative, opposes this, that in qualitative type of studies we can adopt either state orientation or process orientation, meaning are we interested in what is, or are we interested in how something became to be? So if we think of this state orientation, you will ask yourself, which type of event or which type of behavior am I observing? What is this? How often does this occur? What might possibly cause it? How is this maintained? So you're really interested in the current status of the concept that you're investigating. In contrary to the process orientation, once again, those type of questions are more interested in how certain attitudes developed over time, in how certain behaviors developed over time. I will say people were interested in loyalty. I think that's a very relevant question in terms of how do guests become loyal, how do buyers become loyal to a specific brand. That's in the way you perceive such kind of question or a topic already implies this process orientation. Recall what the process is. When we talk about processes, we always talk about inputs and outputs, and we talk about resources needed in order to process those inputs into outputs. So what are the consequences of processes refers to the output. How is behavior changing over time refers to what is actually happening over time. What strategies can be used to to develop such kind of, or are used to develop such kind of behavior is more into the input side. What possibly might be a reason to understand different motivations, for instance. Well, I think this can be a very handy way to look at qualitative type of research questions and ask yourself, what am I actually investigating? Once again, what is or how it became to be. Moving into the quantitative studies, I need to keep track of my time a bit. Quick reminder, well, it's not completely the opposite of qualitative studies, but to a certain extent, it is. The quantitative studies focus on exploring relationships between two or more concepts. They focus on relationships or exploring or comparing groups, and that's actually what you learned here at the NHTV to do. You are trained to run statistical tests which explore relationships between two variables. And you are also trained to run statistical tests to compare groups on one single variable. And that's the least in terms of quantitative analysis that we expect you to perform. And I think some of you can make it challenging and a bit more complex by looking at multiple variables in the studies that you are designing. So when we talk about quantitative studies, we indeed talk about variables. So remember, those refer to characteristics or attributes of people and organizations that vary over time, characteristics and attributes which can be measured or observed. And if they do not vary, then well, it makes no sense, no point to incorporate them in our study. And the outcome, basically, of quantitative studies help you to predict that's inherent in quantitative studies. Quantitative researchers are keen on predicting behavior. They are keen on predicting attitudes. They are keen on finding possible influences of the explanatory concepts. So what are the influences of the X on Y? So what are then the words needed is that your approach, quantitative research indeed work with questions and hypotheses. They help them very much to focus on and identify specifically which relationships they're investigating. Quantitative hypotheses incorporate those predictions about the relationships or about the differences between groups. And for sure, those objectives very, very clearly indicate what you will be able to do with the outcome of your study. Meaning, if you really want to find out how, for instance, operational excellence influence the level of satisfaction, and you aim to be able to predict exactly for instance, which speed of a process influences negatively or positively the level of guest satisfaction, then you will have to run a quantitative type of research if that's what you aim to do. So I think you need to remember that predicting is actually key in quantitative type of research. So when writing hypotheses, this is not really new. Then we work with the zero hypothesis and the null hypothesis, which actually says that there's no difference or no relationship between variables. We formulate alternative hypotheses or directional hypotheses, which do predict differences between groups and relationships between variables. And when we talk about directional and non-directional hypotheses, I must admit that so far during investigative abilities, research methods and techniques, you've been trained to use non-directional hypotheses. So you've been trained to say there is no relationship between X and Y, or there is a relationship between X and Y, and you are actually not trained to say the more of this, the less of that, which will make it a directional hypothesis. What is also very common in this way of thinking when you write research questions is first to, especially when you think of sub-questions related to quantitative type of studies, is that first descriptive questions will be written for each variable in the study, and then another question is formulated which refers exactly to relating the variables or comparing the groups. What are then the action verbs? Well, quite the opposite to qualitative type of study. In this project, you will have to use affect, relate, impact, influence, determine, not cause. I took cause away for the very, very simple reason that in the type of projects that you're dealing with, causation, I believe, is almost impossible. When you study relationships, you study correlations. Think of all the conditions that you have to control in order to be able to talk about cause and effect relationships. So in fact, in real life, we talk about correlations as we cannot possibly eliminate all other possible factors of influence. So you are also going to use those words which indicate the relationships. And most probably you will start then your questions with words to which extent, how, what, etc. For example, what is the relationship between the level of service and the level of satisfaction at company X? To which extent does process efficiency influence the level of satisfaction? How do online reviews influence booking behavior? How do male and female guests differ in their level of satisfaction with the cleaning facilities? Those are questions that I made up myself, but also based on experience that I have with bachelor theses so far here at the NHTV. Let me have a look if there are some questions at this point. I can try and answer now. please use the Q&A and not the chat option. Let me see. Let me go back and see, because I see 3 questions that we have. So Brit is asking if the example of the NHTV Internet and Internet channel, would that be an advice report or a design report? Oh, that's a good one. I didn't think of that. Well, I think both are probably possible. It really depends. It's a hypothetical question, by the way. I didn't take it from a real bachelor thesis. So, you know, the answer to that is I know it's the one you don't like a lot, but it depends. It depends on what is it. If you have a commissioner, what is it the commissioner actually really wants you to deliver? If he sees an advice, then advice suffice. If he sees more than advice what is possible, if he sees more a prototype developed which has been tested during your project, well, that will be the road to go. And sometimes they're so the context is so complex, meaning the wicked problems that we refer to, that there is a problem behind the problem which cannot be solved by giving advices, but which be much better approached by adopting the design thinking. So it's very difficult for me now to say advice or design. I think it really depends eventually on the bigger aim of the project which you have, and on the specific context that you're dealing with. Another question, Latoya is asking, if you want to know the current situation of attractiveness at a company X among current employees, would you recommend qualitative or quantitative type of data? I think it depends on how you define attractiveness. So hold on, I still have about half an hour left. And I'm going to talk exactly about that, about how do we measure the concepts we are investigating. And I think that you might come to the conclusion that some concepts cannot be measured quantitatively, just for the simple reason that you don't think that if you will measure them quantitatively, it will give you that rich and in-depth understanding of the concept. Attractiveness, to be perfectly honest, I think it has been measured quantitatively a lot, especially in HR, OB-related studies. This is also very much related to attractiveness of a brand. So how attractive is it to buy something, or how attractive is it to work for an employer? I think this has been a concept which is studied a lot quantitatively already. Because that also plays a role. Some concepts, like take for instance resistance to change, even though maybe not an ideal example, but resistance to change can be measured by means of a survey. But I wonder myself, how rich will be your understanding of that resistance to change? So I think for the purpose of a study like this, I will opt for qualitative design initially. And only afterwards, if time allows and if needed, I will also follow up by means of a survey. So I think both, Latoya. Another question, I think that's the last for now. Melissa is asking, yeah, improving of the service experience, service quality. We talked about the project a while ago. And she's asking, am I better off by means of quantitative or qualitative type of research? The goal is to improve a service, right? But that's at least in Melissa's case. If your goal is to improve something, again, I would like you to take one step back and ask yourself, what is then my knowledge question? What is that I need to know in order to be able to come up with an advice or a prototype which will enable me to say that if applying this or following my advice, the service experience at that particular company could be improved. So again, what is the question that you need to ask yourself? So what do you need to know first before you can come up with that advice? So it can be the current experience. It can be also what people expect they will experience, and especially service quality is a concept which has been investigated a lot in the past. And I believe that actually both approaches are done, and scientists still follow qualitative and quantitative approach when they study service quality. So it's really at the end of what is that you picture, that you envision, that you will produce for your commissioner. What is it you want to be able to say? Would you like to be able to predict on which factors influence, for instance, experience and quality, so you'll be able to say to the management of a company, if you change these specific factors, then you can expect that will positively influence quality. If you're more keen on really understanding experiences, then I will say qualitative type of design is more your path to take. And I'm going to continue now because one of the examples that I have prepared is exactly that one related to quality. And I took the example of quantitative type of measuring, quantitative way of measuring service quality. A practical question from Martijn. Would you share the PowerPoints of the webinars? I'm always sharing, at least the previous one I shared, and I will definitely share this one. The moment you watch the video on YouTube, in the description of the video, there is a link to the slides. So there you will be able to find the slides for that particular webinar. All right. So far so good. I'm going to continue now with the questions, not with with what I have prepared, and I'll come back again to your question later, because I see that there are some questions in the chat option. So I will come back to them at the end. So let's resume with what I have prepared. All right. So far, enough on research questions, and before we move into the concepts which are part of the research questions and the variables which are part of those concepts, I just would like to remind you to think of this hierarchy of concepts. That when we talk about general research questions, specific research questions, which can be also called sub-questions for that matter, what's in the name, we do not talk necessarily, actually not at all, about data collection questions. The data collection questions are on a much lower level in terms of what exactly you are going to ask your participant in a survey or during an interview, but you really need to distinguish between those different type of questions. They also serve a different purpose eventually. Same goes for the idea of you having a research area, so you being able to situate your project within the field of marketing, or within the field of organizational behavior, or within the field of strategic management, or within the field of real estate, or let's say workplace. So I'll have to say real estate management. That's one thing, that's the research area, but the research topics will be the specific topics of interest. So again, those are two different things, and all those concepts, all those ideas actually related to one another. And I think again of the funnel, the research area is much broader, and the data collection questions obviously are very, very narrowed down to the one specific item that you're interested in. So we talk a lot about concepts, but then you have to ask yourself, what are then concepts? Phenomenon of interest, concepts, they're part of research questions. Are variables then the same as concepts? So I think it's really worth it to briefly explain you where do concepts come from? How do they come to exist? I'll do it by means of this picture. If you look at this picture, and I will ask all of you, what do you see? I'm absolutely sure that I will get many, many different answers. But let's say now, for the sake of the exercise, that we all agree to a certain extent that we see two girls showing compassion. Still, even if we might agree on the fact that we see on the picture compassion, it is most probably possible, it is absolutely the fact that we interpret that idea of compassion differently. Because compassion and the way we think and why we think we see compassion is very much colored by the mental images that we have. And by mental images that I mean all previous experiences that we had in the past related to compassion. And all those mental images actually help us to find words to describe what we see. And what we're actually doing is we are undertaking this conception of what we are observing in this example, human behavior. So this process of coming to a specific agreement of what are we looking at this picture, in fact, is called conceptualization. Well, you can imagine that the result of such conceptualization is known as a concept. And it's important actually to realize that, in fact, those concepts are made up. They do not in reality exist. Those concepts are constructed, and in qualitative, constructed by us. We search for those terms and words, and we search for shared meaning of those words in order to be able to talk about friendship, in order to be able to talk about loyalty, in order to be able to talk about satisfaction, compassion in this example, prejudice. There are so many of those concepts that we use in our daily life without even realizing that we have made them up together. Because that's the only way that we can make sense out of what we are experiencing to start with. In qualitative research, concepts are very often translated into categories of behavior, into categories of motivations, into categories of reasons. In quantitative research, when we talk about concepts, we actually use variables at a later stage in order to describe those concepts. And constructs, to make it a bit more confusing, it's just a word which psychologists in general prefer to use instead of variables. So because basically that implies the idea of those concepts being constructed. From now on, I'm only going to talk about concepts and variables. But trust me, in papers that you read, you most probably will come across the term of a construct. Be aware that it is just another way of talking about variables. This is something that I discussed last time. So what are variables? Variables, again, characteristics of individuals and groups which are measurable and observable. A question immediately related to this is, but what are the things that we can actually measure? And I think Kaplan offers a quite handy distinction between what we can measure. First, he talks about direct observables, things that we simply see directly. Color of our eyes, color of a vegetable, color of a fruit, and the color of an apple, or color of our eyes can have different values, right? You can have brown eyes or blue eyes or green eyes. A person smiling at you is also a quite direct observable. A person either smiles or does not smile at you. That's something that you can directly observe and measure. He also talks about indirect observables, and those are the more subtle and complex issues. I'm going to take the example I have in here of board meetings minutes. We can use board meetings minutes, or we can even observe meetings for that matter. But those minutes, to take that one as example, directly does not tell us everything about the social actions and norms. Those social actions and norms are revealed in the minutes. For instance, do people make agreements on follow-up actions or not? But it is not directly that we observe something like that, but it's more hidden in documents like board meetings or history books, which will tell us something about that. Another example as well is that in a questionnaire, we can ask or we can tick off a cell, female or male, but basically what we are doing is we are ticking off somebody's, indirectly we are registering somebody's gender. And the most interesting of all in our situation is are the constructs. So those theoretical creations, so those concepts that we are talking about, which we cannot observe directly or indirectly, because once again, they do not exist. As I mentioned already, the examples of prejudice, satisfaction, compassion, quality, loyalty, they do not exist in a sense as the color of our eyes or our gender exists and we can observe it, because those are all the concepts that we have made up in order to make sense out of things. So the question is then as well, can we then measure anything that exists? Can we measure those theoretically constructed concepts? Well, quantitative researchers will probably answer with yes, especially because those concepts exist based on the idea that we agree on what they mean. And when we agree on what they mean, we create those working definitions, as they're called, in order to study them. Well, thank God, scientists create those working definitions and report in papers about them. So when you and I read about them, then we share this agreement on what those concepts mean. So they're very, very useful. The definitions, I mean, but the concepts as well are useful because they help us to understand what we are observing. They help us communicate about one and the same thing. At the same time, they also can cause lots of miscommunication. And examples are coming up in a minute what exactly you can look at then when you describe those concepts. But because concepts have working definitions as well, what is actually done, especially in quantitative type of research, we will have to get engaged in what is called moving from theoretical to operational definition. This means that after having a theoretical definition of what loyalty might mean, or what satisfaction might mean, or what prejudice might mean, that alone is not going to help you measure the level of satisfaction or the level of loyalty in your project. That will only give you the theoretical definition and hopefully the definition the scientists agree on. But once again, you cannot yet work with it. The working definition is what we call operational definition in quantitative design and quantitative research. And the moment you move into this operational definition, you're actually getting engaged in specifying exactly what the concept means. I'm going to work now with the example of compassion just for a couple of minutes longer. And you will get involved in describing indicators which possibly reveal compassion. And in some cases, you will also be able to identify even different aspects of compassion called dimensions. So imagine for the sake of exercise that you're interested in this comparison. So are women more compassionate than men? So if we think again of how can we measure compassion, and we go into this conceptualization, and we go to this operational definition, you can think of the indicators as a sign of the presence or the absence of compassion. And I have come up with 4 here. The first indicator of compassion can be if a person visits hospitals for Christmas and brings presents. If a person saves cats from the trees, if a person puts birds back in their nest, if a person feels terrible when a friend gets sick, and so on and so forth. You might be, for instance, able to formulate 10 different indicators for compassion. Think again, the presence or absence of an indicator is telling you something about the presence or an absence of a concept. And in this example, if we ask men and women if they agree or disagree with those, I can formulate them easily as a statement. You can, for instance, ask how important is it for you to visit hospital for Christmas? How important is it for you to save cats fallen from the tree? How often do you feel terrible when your friends get sick? Then we can calculate and we can find out that women on average display 6.5 indicators of compassion and men display 3.2 indicators of compassion. And only looking at this without any statistical analysis, we can say, voila, there is a difference in the level of compassion, and women seem to be more compassionate than men. A very simple example of how you can approach this idea of indicators of a complex concept as compassion in our example. A lot of words with a C. But what you also can do, and what is a lot done in order to not only make sense of what we are measuring and when we report it, but also because very often those concepts which are not directly or indirectly observable are very complex, we can also identify different dimensions. And that also captures the differences in our understanding of compassion in this example. If you look at the first three I have in here, you can say that visiting hospitals, saving cats, putting birds back in the tree, identifies an action. So you can say those indicators of compassion together say something about action related to compassion, to showing compassion. On the contrary, number 4, you feel terrible when your friend gets sick, relates more to a feeling dimension. And those dimensions help us measure and capture the diversity in understanding of what a concept might be. That's why, in general, when you study complex concepts as loyalty, satisfaction, to name these two as an example, service quality, then you need to realize that those are complex concepts and that you will have to get engaged in finding out the different indicators and dimensions used to describe and study that concept. If it's a qualitative type of study, as said in the beginning, you will be able to talk about categories related to that concept. What I have now in the last couple of minutes is I would like to take 3 very much quantitative examples and show them to you. The first one is related to a study on learning and study orientations, which I'm actually engaged with, but I will leave that one as last booking at the time. And I will have a look at the video interviewing and the perceived service quality. Both examples of bachelor theses designed right now. Video interviewing is one of my graduates, and the perceived service quality is, I think, at least 4 or 5 of you are interested in that concept. And I'm going to exit now my slides to open something. And those are 2 papers. The first one is this one, the one on video interviewing. Let me try and make it a little bit bigger. There it is. So this example on video interviewing is actually related to a very interesting bachelor thesis project in which the student is actually interested in the use of video interviewing as a recruitment instrument. And I'm not going to share his whole design with you, but what I would like to show you with this paper is how he has spotted 2 concepts related to video interviews, and how he is going to use a specific paper which actually helps him already identify the operational definitions of that concept. And specifically in his case, he's talking about the overall favorability. Oh my goodness, the overall favorability of video interviewing and the fairness of the interview process. So after a quite extended literature review where it's explained on why video interview matters, what is it exactly, he came into the point of deciding to measure the overall favorability of video interviewing in a specific context, actually within the NHTV, and also the fairness of the interview process. Well, one major mistake you can make when now you design your thesis, your project, is to come up with those indicators and dimensions yourself. I think the very, very first and important step in the process is to search for existing instruments, so existing measurement instruments, meaning searching for studies who already have investigated the concept of interest or investigated the use of video interviewing in this example, and studies which already have tried qualitatively or quantitatively to study the similar phenomenon of interest, similar to yours, I mean. So let's have a quick look at this one. So this is the whole paper, which I am also more than happy to share with you. I don't think that my graduates will mind. Where in the methodology, if read twice, three times even, it's quite well documented in terms of the operational definition of overall favorability. I'm struggling with this word, as you see. So the overall favorability of video interviewing and the fairness of the interview process. The first one is measured by use of 10 items, that means 10 indicators. I will show them to you in a minute, which has been adopted from another scale. And I'm not opening now that original paper of Toby, but my student has done that already. The fairness of interview process is another complex concept. And fairness has been measured by means of 13 items or 13 indicators. And those, so 10 plus 13, measuring those two complex concepts, have been reported in this paper in table 4. In this study, 5-point Likert scale has been used. So what you see here is the complex concept of favorability, which is very much similar as to compassion or loyalty or satisfaction. But then disentangled into this 10 items, into this 10 statements, 10 indicators, each and every one measuring a part of part of favorability. So video interviewing was a positive experience. I feel that video interview should be used in the selection process. I would prefer a phone interview instead of a video interview, and so on and so forth. And in this table, you see the average statistics or the mean reported within the study. But that's not that important. The more important is that actually using this paper and specifically this measurement instrument, and if you find something similar and helpful for your own study, you already actually have your measurement instrument for one or two concepts within your study. This is not everything the particular student will measure, but at least two concepts of his study are already quite clearly defined in terms of operational definitions in here. Those statements, later on in the process, we'll talk about that in the seminars within the course. The students who follow the course are translated into more shorter labels in Excel or SPSS. But for now, it is important to see how the indicators are also reported in papers. Then the one on the perception of service quality. I think Brady and Cronin Jr. has been used already by some of you. This is a paper by Brady and Cronin Jr. One of the students in my group has been shared this one with us. And in here, they actually report on how the concepts of perceived service quality can be measured. The whole idea of service quality in many different service settings is really rather complex. And Actually, here you see how it's disentangled into dimensions, subdimensions, and sub-subdimensions even. And I'm going to go back into the beginning of the paper, which is called Some New Thoughts on Conceptualizing Perceived Service Quality. And what you see in here, what I highlighted yellow, is that the paper is all about the service quality construct, so the service quality concept, let's put it like that, specifically about service quality perception. And in this paper, they report 3 dimensions of service quality perception: the outcome, interaction, and environmental quality. Each of these dimension of service quality has 3 subdimensions, and each of these subdimensions, furthermore, can be, or they claim here in this paper, when measured, that they have to be measured in terms of being reliable, responsive, and empathetic. So this is a rather complicated, a bit more complicated than the fairness I just showed you, as the concept in itself is so complex. And the paper reports quite nicely with the visualization of what I just read out loud in this one. So in here, you basically see how the idea of perceived service quality can be disentangled into 3 dimensions: the one of interaction quality, of physical environment quality, of outcome quality. And on its turn, the interaction quality can be disentangled into attitude, behavior, and expertise, and those have 3 sub-dimensions as well. How is that then translated further into the actual, I need to scroll down, into the actual indicators in the survey and the sub-dimension? It's very well reported in the appendix and the survey items, where you see that the authors have used a 7-point Likert scale. They also clearly say that an R indicates a reliability item, an SP, those are all the abbreviation between the brackets behind each and every statement. So a statement has been coined as being related to reliability, 1 to responsiveness, and 1 to empathy. Those 3 sub-dimensions, as we read at the beginning, also seem to be important when you study perceived service quality. And basically in here, you see again the same labels of the dimensions and the sub-dimensions, including the indicators. So including the lowest level of measuring this rather complex concept of perceived service quality. So basically, what you can conclude is that if you are interested in measuring perceived service quality, this specific, and there are many more papers by Brady and Cronin or other authors using Brady and Cronin, if you will search carefully in the paper, you will find the operational definitions yourself already. And this enables you to say, all right, I'm also interested in similar concept, but in a completely different context. I can already deduct from this paper that it's a reliable way of measuring perceived service quality. And what exactly are you going to measure then? You measure 3 main dimensions, each having 3 sub-dimensions, and each having 3 different types of indicators, all reported in this appendix. So sometimes a very, very slight modification is needed, and sometimes no modification at all is needed in order to follow this line of thinking and use the same items to measure perceived service quality quantitatively, in this case, if you're interested in it. My time is actually almost up, so I'm going to go, it is up, I'm going to go back to my slides. So I went rather quick through the examples. I will spare you the first one, the LSQ. Unless you're interested in learning and study orientations yourself, please drop me an email and I'm going to share this one with you. But the whole idea is that within each and every research question that you have, you already talk inevitably about the concept of interest. And when you think of the concept of interest, you need to realize that if you are going to conduct a qualitative study, that you will have to think of categories related to that concept. And by finding out a suitable model or theory to study what you're interested in, you will be able to find the lens to what you look at. If you are more interested in, or you're planning to set up a quantitative type of study, but it's much more than advisory to search for existing measurement instruments, so to search for papers who already provide you with those operational definitions, already help you define not only theoretically, but also operationally, meaning what is exactly that you're going to measure, and that will help you a lot in making the decisions yourself in your methodology and in actually conducting your own study. The references that I used again are Creswell and Gray. I think Gray offers lots of valuable input in terms of formulating questions and also in terms of concepts later on. And for sure, the book of Creswell I used previously. Let me quickly have a look if there are questions. And for the people who are going to leave us, thank you for listening. Let me stop sharing this and see if there's some questions. Avi's asking, I'm not quite sure how to use the concept, and you're confused. Yeah, the other concepts coming out of the research questions, exactly, Avi. So when, for instance, let me go back to some of the examples I had previously on slides. Let's take this one. If, for instance, if you have a quantitative, just for the sake of exercise, for the sake of example, if your research question is, what is the relationship between the level of service and the level of satisfaction? Well, actually, the level of service and the level of satisfaction are the two concepts you're interested in. And then the next step will be to ask yourself, how is service defined? How is satisfaction defined theoretically? And how am I going to measure level of service and level of satisfaction, which will actually mean that you have to get engaged into this operational definition of service and satisfaction, which is nothing more, nothing less than answering the question, what exactly am I going to measure in my project when I talk about service and when I talk about satisfaction? Let's see. A practical question from Danny, possible to use the article Brady and Cronin in combination of qualitative and quantitative research? Yeah, for sure. To be honest, one of my graduates last year had done that. She basically used the whole idea of the ServQual, of measuring service quality, not only by using the same items we just saw, but also thinking of topics for an interview protocol and using those topics related to the interaction. So that was one of the main dimensions. So you can say that using the three main dimensions in a qualitative design can be done for sure. Why not? Because this is a quite well tested definition already of service quality. So absolutely, with a bit of a modification, thinking into what's feasible for you, that's definitely possible. And I don't necessarily think that will make it too broad, but it once again, it really depends on the time that you have as well, and the time you have to spend on your project. So no more questions in the Q&A. I'm going to quickly have a look at the chat. Let me see. Just quickly. So is it possible to use qualitative and quantitative questions? So is it yeah, that's so can I use qualitative and quantitative research? That's what we call mixed design, to be perfectly honest. And some of you have elements of quantitative and some of you have elements of qualitative. Yeah. Keep in mind that this is called mixed design, and that you will most probably get engaged in what it's known as sequential mixed design, meaning that you'll either first conduct the quantitative part and then the qualitative, or the other way around, depending on your goal and depending on the type of questions. It might make sense to first do the quantitative part and then the qualitative, and the other way around. But that's mixed design that we are talking about. So I hope that answers Malou. Let's have a look quickly. Charlotte is asking if it's, I don't quite understand what you mean, research report and advisory report. Well, when you write your bachelor thesis, you will have to choose between advisory report, design report, or a business plan. If you didn't watch yet the 3 approaches to a bachelor thesis, I strongly recommend you to do so. The clip, which is made by my colleague Hans Westerbeek, is available for the people following the course, but also for everyone else. And I think we uploaded it last week on our YouTube channel, where you can also find the webinars. So looking at your question, Charlotte, I think you really need to have a look at that video first. So each and every type of bachelor thesis is a research report, but it's either advisory, design, or a business plan. And I think so far so good. I have covered all the questions. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you this week again, online or offline, and otherwise after our carnival break. Bye-bye.